Hello, everyone. This is Aaron Stofker from Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative. We'll give folks another minute or two to jump on as I see a few more attendees jumping on currently. Well, it's 2 minutes after, and I'm going to get started with today's webinar, the new dairy workforce bill and what you need to know. I'm Aaron Stofker, Associate Director of Government Affairs for Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative, as well as Dairy Business Association here in Wisconsin, where I am based. A few housekeeping measures before we get started. All of the attendees are in listen-only mode today until we open it up for questions at the end. And I'll go through how you can ask questions, but we do have quite a bit of material to go over today. So we will hold questions until the end. You can, if you come up with a question throughout today's webinar, there is on your webinar taskbar a little hand signal that you can raise, and my colleague Maria or I will be able to see that your hand is raised, and then we will unmute you to ask a question. You can also ask a question in your webinar toolbar under the questions tab, and then Maria and I will be able to see that and hopefully provide you an answer. So before we get started, just want to kind of provide a little bit of a roadmap on what I'm going to be talking about. As I did say, we do have a lot of material that I am going to try to get done pretty quickly in about 40-45 minutes to allow ample time for your questions, because we do have a fair amount of people on today's webinar, and I am expecting a number of questions. And if you don't come up with any questions today, please feel free to contact me afterwards by phone or email, text, or any other means you can think of to get those answers. And I will try to answer them to the best of my ability or track down an answer for you. Along with, because we will be covering a lot of materials, and your questions might come up throughout the webinar, please remember, if you can, the title that we were talking about, or I've also provided slide numbers at the lower right-hand corner of the screen, and just reference that, and we'll pull that slide back up to get what your question is covering. So what we're going to be covering, I'm going to provide a little bit of a background on how this workforce bill came to be, and as well as share Edge's involvement. Talk a little bit about the introduction of what is called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. Then I'm going to dive right into the bill. HR 4916 is the bill number. I'll divide it, for the purposes of today's webinar, I'm dividing it into 3 titles. So if you do have a question, remember what title it does fall under, and we can jump to it. So Title 1, well, actually first, maybe I'll step back and say So EDGE has an ag labor policy uh, that whenever a workforce proposal comes up in Congress or through other means, we evaluate it on its ability to ensure that our dairy farmers can retain their existing workers, because it's a fact that existing workers that have been here for sometimes decades have become an integral part of our operations. So we do have to make sure it does have an ability to ensure our existing workers transition into a proper status. And then secondly, the second tier, or second prong, I should say, of that EDGE policy is to make sure that we have a pathway to recruit and have new workers or new foreign-born workers be able to come to the U.S. and work on our farms. So Title I, I'm going to be covering what is in this bill for our existing workers. Title II, I'm going to be going through the creation of a new pathway that would allow you as dairy farmers to bring new workers and new employees into the U.S. And then third, as with any ag labor or any other immigration bill, we're going to be talking about a third component of this bill, which is E-Verify. And I can explain what E-Verify is when we get there. And then I'll be talking a little bit about what we have to do to get this across the finish line, and a little bit of insight into the politics behind making that happen. So I'm going to start the time period of providing the background for this bill really last fall, and maybe even going back into last session. So as many of you remember, last session, many ag groups, in EDGE included, we were working on efforts spearheaded by Representative Bob Goodlatte, a Republican from Virginia. But importantly, he was chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. So the House Judiciary Committee is the committee in the House of Representatives where any workforce or immigration proposal has to clear going through committee before it can be considered by the entire House floor. So as many of you know, it was a long-standing effort by Representative Goodlatte to correct the inadequacy of our current programs that prohibit certain agriculture sectors from participating in the existing programs, as well as making it totally a new program overall. So last summer, going into last fall, Representative Goodlatte introduced a bill called the Ag and Legal Workforce Act. On that bill, there was 112 co-sponsors in the House out of a possible 435. That bill, as it ended, was introduced in July, but as you all know, what happened last November with an election coming up. So going into August recess, it was a little bit of TBD in terms of whether this bill was going to be taken up in September after the House came back from recess, but a shortened window before the elections. Unfortunately, the House did not take the bill up, and that's where the efforts expired last fall when the elections occurred. So what happened in those elections? Prior to the November elections, we had a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican presidency. However, the House flipped from Republican to Democrat, really bringing us into an era of divided government. And I say divided government in meaning that one of the chambers of Congress is controlled by the opposite party of the other two chambers of Congress. So what that presents is a challenge to get anything across the finish line just because you do have to appease more constituents within those two parties to make sure a proposal clears through the House, clears through the Senate, and then has the support of the current sitting president. So after the elections last November, coming off of what was a very tremendous effort by the agricultural community as well as representatives from the House, a lot of those efforts were, with the divided government, that we weren't really sure, and I say we as in a lot of the ag groups in the U.S. in terms of, well, what are the realistic chances of having something being proposed, introduced, and have the potential ability to carry the water across the finish line. So last spring, as the Democrats won back the House, Zoe Lofgren became the chairwoman of the subcommittee on immigration in the committee of the Judiciary Committee. I think I got that right. Yes, I did. And when she became that, she ultimately became the gatekeeper for any ag workforce proposals that have the potential to make it through Congress. So pretty much anything, if it were to pass, it has to go through and have the approval of her committee and ultimately the approval of her. So last spring, Representative Lofgren, Democrat from California, being the chairwoman of the subcommittee, of the appropriate subcommittee, she reached out to constituents that were working on the Good Lot proposal and like, hey, let's work on this, much to the surprise of many in the ag community, in her wanting to take up these efforts back up and work on something. And since Representative Goodlatte retired, I would say maybe second in command and second who is carrying the water behind Representative Goodlatte was Representative Dan Newhouse, a Republican out of Washington that represents mainly the central part of Washington where a lot of the dairy is in the state. They brought together a group of constituents to begin conversations in the spring and really parsing through ideas in terms of like, okay, if something were to be proposed at a bipartisan effort that has the ability to carry all the way through up to the presidency and have the support of President Trump, we need to bring everyone to the table and bring everyone to the table because we do have a divided government now. So from the ag side, the agricultural community, which was represented by the Agricultural Workforce Coalition. The AWC, the acronym, is a broad constituency of ag groups across the United States. They have the membership represents everyone from the almond growers, dairy, and current H-2A employers, and importantly, EDGE is a member, and so we've been engaged in these conversations through the AWC. They also, knowing that they had to bring all constituents to the table, they reached out to farm labor groups and brought them into the loop to really see if we could hammer something out that has the support of both sides of the equation, which really needs to be there for something to move forward. So starting in spring, negotiations and conversations were happening, I think starting in April, all the way up to 2 weeks ago when the bill was actually introduced. What were they doing? As I'm sure it wasn't really shared in terms of the details they were discussing, and that was by design, because if something did slip out and was leaked out of those conversations, you would start to see groups on the opposite side. So you have your more right-wing pro-U.S. worker groups, and then your far left farm labor unions that really, their goal is to watch out for farm workers. So conversations were happening mainly behind the scenes. Edge was engaged in those. However, we weren't in the room at the time of those negotiations were taking place, but we did have the ability to provide input from our dairy members' perspective throughout the conversations, and so they could insert it into their negotiations and really act as a sounding board through some of those conversations. So as I said, introduction was only 2 weeks ago. So the Farm Workforce Modernization Act was introduced actually 2 weeks ago this Wednesday, introduced as Bill number 4916. And actually right up until introduction, I was actually out in DC with many of the other AWC working group members in trying to secure not only additional support for co-sponsorship, but at least putting it on other representatives' radar. So as Representative Lofgren and Representative Newhouse are from opposite sides of the aisle, they did want to have a broad bipartisan constituency of original co-sponsors. So original co-sponsors are folks that sign onto a bill on introduction to really signify their support. When the impact of an original co-sponsor, what it really has is it signals to other representatives in the House is that this is something they care about, this is something they've been working on, and this is something that ultimately passes the litmus test in terms of this is something they could and should possibly support. So it was introduced with 23 Democrats and 29 Republicans. So it doesn't get much more bipartisan than that. It was going to both Democratic and Republican houses or offices to get support, and that's what we're currently working on. We are now up to 46 co-sponsors, and within Edge's footprint, so out of South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, there are 3 of the 46 that are in Edge's footprint. So Colin Peterson, who is from Western Minnesota as a Democrat, Fred Upton, who is from Southwest Michigan, and then Angie Craig, who is in Minnesota, just below the Twin Cities. On introduction, details weren't really shared too much in advance of introduction, just because, going back to that confidentiality of the behind the scenes negotiations. However, it ultimately came to a point where 286 agricultural organizations and food companies did have the ability to review it and ultimately sign on to a broadly supported letter of support addressed to Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the minority leader of the Republican Party, Kevin McCarthy. A pretty short, simple letter stating all of these ag organizations and their support of this. However, before we dive into the review, I do want to put out there that, and I don't think there's any better language than what was actually in that letter that was so broadly signed by many people. So while the bill does include a few provisions that raise significant concerns for the agricultural community, us as groups are committed to working together throughout the legislative process to fully address those issues. And I guess looking at it from the input and stakeholder input that I've had, this bill isn't a perfect bill. So there's things that you'll probably find unattractive as I'm going through this. There's things that you probably will find very attractive, but I do want to say it is not the perfect bill as it exists right now, as for agricultural employers. And there are some concerning measures throughout the bill, some of which I'll point out and raise for your attention as I jump into it. And I guess I'll explain how we can address some of those concerns later in the slideshow as we talk about legislative process a little bit. So jumping into Title I. what are the provisions in this bill for the existing workers on our farms right now? So a term that I'm going to say, or an acronym, or a term I'm going to say a lot throughout this webinar is CAW, and that stands for a Certified Agricultural Worker. And that is the status that this bill creates. It's really a visa status that this bill creates for the workers that are on our farms right now. To walk through the eligibility a little bit, so for them to obtain a CAW status, they do have to show that they have been working in agriculture, which is important. So it's not just anyone that can apply for this status. It is our folks and our workers that are working in agriculture. And to show, they must prove that they've been working in agriculture on your farms for at least 180 work days over the last 2-year period. Some might ask, well, that's not very many work days. Well, that's right. That's right in the sense that it isn't very many work days compared to some of the workers that are working on your farms. But they did want to incorporate the folks that are working in seasonal jobs that are here, or folks that could be considered dependent spouses that might not work up to a full slate or a full-time hourly position. So the other big three to be eligible beyond the work requirements is that the worker, when they apply, they must be currently inadmissible or deportable from the United States. In other words, that's saying, well, they must currently be here, currently be residing in the United States without the proper documentation. And while they apply for this CAW status, they must be present in the United States until they are granted that CAW status. And then the third one, or the fourth one, they must otherwise be admissible. So they're inadmissible, but now they're admissible. And I put a plus or minus sign because there are minuses in terms of, to be admissible right now, you can't be currently inadmissible. So there are safeguards to ensure that the existing workers, or any existing worker that is here without the proper documentation, they are protected from meeting the background checks and the criminal background checks of that fourth bullet point. But then I also do have a plus sign there, and that is because this bill, or I guess stepping back, to be admissible as someone applying for a visa, you do have to meet a criminal background check. This is meeting a criminal background check plus. And so there are more specific provisions in relating to passing an additional background check. So, for example, right now you can't have a felon, you can't be I guess I'll oversimplify it. You can't have a felony on your record. However, this goes a little bit above and beyond in saying you can't have a felony, but then you can't have over a certain number of misdemeanors. You can't have committed any crimes of moral turpitude. So that's basically crimes against another person, or a crime that is irreprehensible in the eyes of society, and that is really going to meet. I guess I should step back. There are things in here to meet and trigger support of other constituents throughout the legislative process. So there might be some things in here that you see that would appeal to the current president or a Republican Senate or a certain Republican senator, because they've worked on these efforts before, and that could be one going to meet that constituent's priorities. So once the worker themselves falls under the CAW status, there is a dependent status that does allow for dependent spouses and minor children to accompany that CAW worker, so they don't have to leave the United States if they've been here. so that this, in short, it takes care of spouses and their children, workers' spouses and children going forward. So you're thinking as an employer, so what do I have to do as the employer to have a worker fall under this status? Well, ultimately, the burden is on the worker applying for the cost status to prove that they've been working in agriculture to meet that 180-day requirement. However, you're probably thinking, well, they can't do that alone, right? So there are safeguards built into this bill that does allow for additional protections as an employer from prosecution if you do assist an applicant. And I do have the unless there because you can assist an applicant, but it can't be a fraudulent assistance to have them under status. So if this bill does become law, make sure if there's anything else to remember, do everything by the book, or try to do everything to the best of your ability by the book to have your existing workers fall under the status. And additionally, one thing that you all might find appealing is right now it could be burdensome for you as an employer or a worker as an applicant to really apply for the cost status. And so the bill ultimately does direct the Department of Labor with the help of USDA to create a process for CAW applicants to go to FSA offices to file their applications. And so then you're thinking, well, how much time do I have or how much time does a worker have to fall under the appropriate status before they're, before you as the employer has to comply with that third Title E-Verify. So it does grant an 18-month window for existing workers to apply for the CAW status after the interim final rule is published. Well, what does that mean? So this bill directs the DOL to publish a final rule after 6 months after the president signs the bill. So in reality, you're looking at a few months and then that 18-month window time clock start to tick. So what is cost status? So essentially, it's a 5.5-year visa, and it's a visa where there are no touchbacks or really any other requirements, unless there's some H-2A stuff that you might have to fall into. But it's really a free market-based visa, 5.5 years. And that visa is renewable for another 5.5 years if that applicant continues to work in agriculture and they can show that they've been working in agriculture for at least 100 work days a year, each year of those 5 years. Again, you're thinking, well, that's not very many days. It's really to meet the folks of those seasonal workers that could be currently here. Harvesting vegetables and produce and other commodities that way. The second big bullet point to hit for that visa to be renewable is the immigrant has to, or the worker has to continue to be eligible as a visa applicant. So it's meeting that criminal background check and making sure that they haven't committed any crimes. But it is something worth pointing out right now is, well, if they do commit a crime on the visa, they're deportable on the conviction of that crime. So I'll just put that out there for right now, and we might come back to it. Then at the end of that 5 years, the bill is very stringent in saying that the application has to be within 120-day window at that 5-year mark, just so folks aren't blowing past deadlines and making sure the agencies have enough time to process applications. So what if a worker cannot show the ag work requirements for the certified ag worker status? The bill does a lot for an option to allow those workers that cannot show that 180-day requirement over the last 2 years to be eligible without leaving the country if they can show 100 work days of agriculture work within the last 3 years. So it's a little bit of a, you could view this as an incentive for those folks that have left agriculture to come back into ag. That's how some people see it, but it does allow for another pathway for maybe some folks who can't meet that requirement. And then over and above the certified ag worker status, and I threw this on the slide even though it relates to the cost status, but it does go above and beyond. And that is the option for an earned lawful permanent residence, an LPR. What essentially that is green card status. It is not citizenship status, green card status. And it is really an option. If a worker wants to remain under that cost status, going through that 5-year renewal process every year, that's fine. They can continue to do that. However, it does create a process for those folks who meet the requirements of an LPR to transition into a more permanent residence. So for that lawful permanent residence to be granted, the applicant has to show that they've been working in 10 years prior to this bill's enactment. So whenever the president signs this bill, and then they have to be working essentially another visa period under the cost status. So essentially, that's they have to prove and show that they've been working in agriculture for 14 years and continue to work in agriculture if they don't meet that. So what this really is, it's earned because we are recruiting the folks that do want to work and will work for this program. However, if one of those cow workers has been working in ag or cannot show that they've been working in agriculture for 10 years, because they met the requirements of CAW, of the certified ag worker status, that 180 days within the last 2 years, they have to continue working under a CAW status for the next 8 years. So essentially, they'll be working in ag for an X amount of years that is under 10, and then another 8 years in agriculture in this status to become eligible. Well, then again, that applicant has to remain admissible, as we discussed before, passing a criminal background check and other background checks. But then they do have to pay a $1,000 penalty fee for the transitional status of transitioning into a green card. So jumping to Title II. So this Title II, the Pathway for New Workers, it's a little bit complex because it utilizes the existing H-2A program. I know there's a lot of, because dairy folks can't use the H-2A program as it exists right now under current statutory law. There are a lot of stories out there, some good, some bad, that probably sway your thinking when folks bring up the H-2A program, and we'll discuss them going down through. But I do want to highlight what is the pathway, what would be a pathway for new workers on our dairy farms. So within the H-2A program that currently exists, what is currently the Ag Workforce Visa, it would create a 3-year visa, or I should say up to a 3-year visa that does allow for year-round ag work, aka dairy farms. However, you have to meet all the other H-2A requirements, and as we'll go through, this bill does modify some of those H-2A requirements, and it's only up for it's 36 months. It's a 3-year time period, and then as one of the as one of the lower bullet points out, after that 3-year period, that worker must depart and remain outside of the United States for at least 45 days. So what essentially this is doing is, it's unlike other proposals in the past where there was one program for all your workers to fall under, both existing and a new pathway. This would separate the two, and falling under Title I would be our existing workers, and then any new workers from this point forward that are not currently here, they would have to fall under this program or another program that dairy farms use, such as TN and H-1Bs. So that, however, there is a problematic provision within this visa as it exists right now. So it does contain a cap, a limitation on the available visas for 3-year visas. So for the first 3 years, it is capped at 20,000 visas per year. However, there is a dairy carve-out with half of them allotted for dairy. So at year 3, essentially, there'd be 60,000 new visas for year-round ag, and 30,000 of those allotted just for dairy farmers. What does it do after year 3? So at the end of year 3, going into year 4, it authorizes the Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to adjust that cap by no more than 12.5% from the preceding year for the first 7 years. So if you're looking into year 4, dairy folks might be looking at 12,500 visas, or not that many. Additional, a growing number of visas throughout the next 7 years. And then the bill at year 10, it gives the Department of Labor or USDA the authority to decide on whether those caps are necessary, and if they are, establish new caps. As I said, those workers at the end of 3 years must depart and remain out of the United States for 45 days. And then something I did throw in there as a inherent part of the H-2A program right now is that the H-2A program is really based around a work contract. And so an H-2A worker establishes a work contract through some requirements that I'll go through here in a minute with an employer, and that work contract specifies dates of need and dates that worker is going to be working at that employer. So workers have a little bit of a grace period of 10 days, arriving 10 days prior to the work contract, and then having a discretionary 45 days to depart the United States for home or just outside of the United States before they can be eligible for a new visa. So I just talked about what would be the pathway for dairy farmers to use the H-2A program. Now I'm going to step into what is a modernized H-2A program. And some of what I'm going to be talking about are the existing requirements of H-2A, and I'll also try to point out the changes that the bill makes in terms of reforming the H-2A program. And I guess through the H-2A program is where a lot of those concerns could be found, and certainly our concerns could be found, because what H-2A really is, it's a program that is really grounded in the premise that U.S. ag employers cannot fill their open positions with native U.S. labor. So, in turn, they have to turn to foreign-born labor. But the H-2A program has a lot of safeguards in there that you can hire foreign-born labor, but not to the detriment of any United States worker or native-born worker in the United States. And then on top of that, there are farm worker protections that some folks on the webinar might view as burdensome. So starting with how do I recruit or petition a worker or to have an H-2A worker? So starting off, you as an employer or a dairy farmer as an employer does have to certify that that they can't really find any other U.S. workers to take their job, and they must show that they did not fire any United States workers within a certain amount of days before posting this job opening. What this really shows is you're not hiring foreign-born labor at the detriment of any U.S. labor. So to meet that certification requirement, so you as the employer must post the job. It was formerly the newspaper. However, through some rulemaking efforts, they are trying to update that to an online registry. And then the employer must contact former U.S. workers of that open job opportunity. I'll just leave it at that, and I'll let you guys decide how you feel about that. And I'm going to try to cruise through the rest of this. So after you certify that you cannot hire any U.S. workers and you have to turn to foreign labor, you have to petition the Department of Labor. And so you have to petition for a job need, and then the Department of Labor must approve. There were certain aspects within the petitioning procedure that would, I guess, air quotes, streamline it. But because we don't have a lot of experience with the H-2A program, I guess we'll find out how streamlined that is. But it does allow, which I do think it is good, that formally or under current law, you have to petition for each worker individually. This would allow an employer to petition for a number of workers within one petition. So essentially, that's a good change. The other burdensome requirement in making sure that you're not hiring any foreign-born labor to the detriment of any U.S. workers is that you as an employer must hire any U.S. worker who shows up and applies for a job until 30 days after the work contract begins, or 33% of the work contract has expired, whichever is later. So for folks using the 3-year visa for dairy, it's essentially you have to hire any U.S. worker going up to a year of that contract. And what folks do, that is something that was reduced in this bill. It is currently 50% of the work contract, so essentially that'd be a year and a half. But that is a provision that is concerning. And then going to the wage requirements. So the minimum wage requirements in the bill as they currently exist right now is that employer has to pay whichever is the highest of the minimum wage, state or federal, the regional prevailing wage, or this thing called the adverse effect wage rate, otherwise known as AEWR. And so what that essentially is USDA through NAS calculates or surveys what the regional weighted hourly job rate is, or wage rate is, for a certain worker position. So for livestock positions, well, what is everyone else paying workers in the region to work with livestock, or vice versa, working with equipment? So what is everyone in the region paying for to work with equipment? So in recent years, it has been growing quite steadily, and to some of our folks from South Dakota in specific, they've seen over the last couple of years some pretty uncertain increases year to year because it's an annual survey. And so, for instance, in 2018 to 2019, South Dakota, for instance, saw a 23% increase in the minimum wage they had to be paying their employees, which is a pretty big jump. One thing that is good in this bill as it relates to the H-2A program, it does limit the ability year to year for those increases for the next 10 years. So for 2019, or for 2020, that's a typo there, it would be frozen under the 2019 wage rates. For 2020 through 29, year to year, it could not increase more than 3.25%, which is actually a very big win for H2A employers as it exists right now. But if dairy farmers were allowed to use this, it would give a little bit more certainty into the process. And then after a 10-year period, USDA and DOL would have to come up with a new wage rate. An example of some of the current adverse effect wage rates right now for some of our members: Wisconsin's looking at $13.54, the same as Minnesota, and then South Dakota is looking at $14.38, and then Iowa, Illinois is around $13.30, and Michigan's about the same too. So that was an example of the adverse effect wage rate, but turning to a few other wage requirements. So this more applies to seasonal folks. So you as an employer fills out a work contract for an H-2A worker, and you have a specified amount of work for them to do. So under current law, and it remains in this bill, is whether that worker, for whatever reason, minus some pretty severe circumstances, the employer is responsible for fulfilling at least 3/4% of the work specified in that contract. You're responsible for providing it to them, or you're responsible for providing their wages for that work. So that is something that would be a concern of more seasonal folks. However, we really don't see that being a huge concern of the folks of our year-round dairy labor. And then one other good thing viewed by seasonal folks is that it does establish wage limitations during the contract. So under current law, if a new wage rate comes out throughout the period of the work contract, then the worker would be automatically entitled to that new wage rate. What this does, it does limit the ability for wages to jump during the midst of a work contract, except for our dairy farmers, as they would be employing for year-round workers. So essentially, it would be, this is the wage rate for the next year, and then we're going to be subject to the new adverse effect wage rate as it pertains going out next November. So if you're hiring from going forward from this January to December 31st this year, you would fall under this year. And then as this time next year, you'd be looking at the new adverse effect wage rate subject to the limitations for any new contracts. Going through some of the other requirements inherent in the H-2A program, there are certain housing requirements. Employers do have to provide regularly inspected housing, and then sometimes family housing. And I did italicize regularly inspected housing because that housing does have to meet safety standards, aka OSHA standards, and does have to be inspected. And that is probably one of the things that we find unfortunate about the H-2A program. And then over and above the housing, the employer must provide 3 daily meals or furnish cooking kitchen facilities for workers to prepare their own meals. Looking at it from the dairy perspective and what our dairy farmers are looking at, it'd probably fall under the furnish cooking and kitchen facilities for the workers to prepare their own meals within the housing program. There are transportation requirements that I'm sure you've heard of before. So not only that do you have to provide safe daily to and from work travel, their employers do have to pay inboard and outboard expenses for travel, and not only travel, subsistence as it relates to food, beverage throughout their travel time. So that's really getting to the fact of making sure, if you have an X amount of employees coming up on a bus, that those folks are stopping for food, water, and whatnot. There are some existing issues within points of origin and the point of the workplace in in providing some certainty to this travel expenses, but I won't jump into those right now. There are worker protections in the program in this bill as well. Existing law treats existing H-2A workers the same as H-2A or U.S. workers, so they would fall under the state and federal employment regulations. Farms would have to create safety plans, but then something that is very concerning in this bill to agricultural employers is that it does provide some new causes of actions for those workers, and not only for those workers, but outside entities or individuals who could be pursuing litigation on behalf of those workers or inadequacy of the employer. As I said, this bill had a lot of fingers in it behind the scenes, and to appeal to all constituencies. It did have to have certain aspects in the bill, especially at this point when some of those aspects are in the democratically controlled House of Representatives. So we are going to see some labor-oriented provisions within this bill, and we've certainly been discussing them. I'll touch on these really quickly. It does allocate, it does triple the amount of funds for grants and then low interest loans for employers to bring up to standard existing housing or housing that has been previously used but can't meet code anymore, and then build new housing for H-2A workers. It triples the amount by tens of millions of dollars, and then provides certain restrictions to make sure only a couple folks aren't getting those millions of dollars. It does create a pilot program. We'll see how well this works. It's essentially the H-2A program and trying to make it portable and at will as possible, because something maybe I should have specified is the H-2A program isn't exactly portable and at will. You agreed to a contract as an employer, as the worker agreed to a contract to work. So essentially, you are tied to that worker, and then meeting the requirements found elsewhere in the program. This bill would also add an additional, add more green cards for those folks using them and folks that could be eligible for them in the future. So it would add 40,000 new, what are employment-based green cards called EB3s, EB3 visas, and essentially they would be cut out for unskilled labor, folks that are working on the farms that can't show 2 years of education, and then they would be scheduled with preference for agricultural employers. And then I can't finishing up the third title of the bill, E-Verify. So this bill, as any other ag workforce proposal that has had any serious chance of getting done or making headway through the next steps, is in. So it's included in most other proposals, and it's always usually introduced as standalone legislation by certain members on the right. And what that means is it's out there. It's out there as a marker bill, something that they want in a workforce bill or an immigration bill, as something that it has to be in there for certain folks in certain constituencies to represent. So what is E-Verify? It's essentially it's an electronic employment verification system that you enter the employee's information and it kicks back whether they're eligible or not. Right now, folks only have to use the I-9 process, so this would be a pretty heightened process of making sure your workers have the proper documentation. So with that, because just to slap E-Verify on right now or very soon wouldn't exactly be fair. For folks that haven't had the ability to use any program previously. So there is a phase-in. There is a phase-in program under this bill. So after that initial 18-month CAW period that we talked about, so uh, 18 months, and then after 18 months, uh, another there would be another time period that is granted to you as an employer, depending on how many employees you have, uh, to start complying with E-Verify. I have it in the chart right there. So an employer that hires 57 employees, they would have 18 months to bring all of their existing workers into that cost status. And then 12 months out from that, 18-month period, so essentially 3 years later, 36 months later, no, 2.5 years later, sorry, they would have to start complying with E-Verify. Just for a little bit of comparison, looking back at the Ag and Legal Workforce Act, under that bill, the E-Verify phase-in for 1 to 19 employees was 24 months. So this is a little bit more favorable to employees. And then for those employers, and then there was a certain cutout for employers employing 20 to 500 employees, and that cutout was for that phase-in period was 18 months. So talking about what needs to happen, this is pretty high level, but I'll try to go through it quickly. So we're at the very bottom level, looking all the way up and all the stairs that we have to climb. So these are the Georgetown stairs. If anyone's seen The Exorcism, this is the ending scene of The Exorcism in DC. So I thought it was kind of cool to apply something from DC to my webinar today, and we always try to do that a little bit. So what needs to happen for this bill to ultimately be signed into law? So as is introduced in the House right now, so it's introduced and referred to the Judiciary Committee. So in committee, it must be marked up. So marked up means that any amendments can be offered, and then it must have the approval from the majority of committee level members to pass out of committee. And once it's passed out of committee, essentially it would be up for a vote on the House floor. Right now, the current state of play in the House is there's 234 Democrats to 199 Republicans. Recognizing that this bill is pretty bipartisan, you're going to lose folks on the far right and you're going to lose folks on the far left. So it's really finding that middle number of folks that would support this bill. But after it gets past the House, that's the first step. It must be introduced, picked up by the Republican-led Senate, which through the legislative process, as we've talked about before, some of the provisions that do raise those concerns throughout the legislative process, where other folks have the ability to introduce certain amendments, those changes could be made. But in terms of looking at the Senate, the current state of play right now is there's 53 Republicans to 47 Democrats, and for a bill to be passed without filibuster is 60 votes. So I have under the bullet point passage a few question marks because it's really kind of up in the air right now. The House put forward something that they believe would garner the support of the Senate and then President Trump, but it's still TBD. Just last Friday, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Lindsey Graham, has said that it's very hard for a standalone bill like this without looking at the rest of the immigration system to pass through Congress. So while those comments, shared kind of a negative light on the bill, I think folks are still pretty optimistic in having some folks in the Senate pick this bill up and at least work on it. But then the third step of the equation is it has to have the support of President Trump. So what we know is that the administration knows about it. He hasn't said anything yet. he hasn't tweeted anything yet, as we've seen in the past. And so we're working until us and the ag community is really working until it's shot down. And then we'll probably still work on it a little bit and try to meet some of those concerns. But I think all eyes are watching for any indication in his statements or over the Twitter account in terms of his support or disapproval of this bill. So what you can do to help right now is for this bill to get to a place where we can address some of those concerns, we do have to have it pass through the House of Representatives. Currently, we do have 46 of 435 representatives in the House on the bill. However, we do need to have more folks committed to a yes vote on the House floor. So what we've been trying to do is at least get this bill on folks' radar. And I have Edge's footprint there, minus North Dakota and some districts in Minnesota, Illinois, and Iowa, and eastern Nebraska. There are 11 Republicans and 7 Democrats that are not currently on this bill right now that could be supportive of this. We've laid some initial groundwork with those offices, and then working a little bit harder on some, more so than others that have shown a history of bipartisanship and wanting and willingness to work on this issue. But it would always help if you as members would reach out to your elected officials, and at least if you don't 100% support this, tell your elected official to be in the conversation, to be looking at this, to be engaged in this. The easiest thing I have for you in terms of today's webinar, without getting too complicated with links and whatnot, it's as simple as going to the house.gov, and then in the upper right hand corner, you're going to see a little box that looks like what's exactly on the screen. You're going to type in your zip code. It's going to bring up your elected official and a link to their contact information. You can write letters, you can send a quick email, and if you do want to email the specific ag staffer, please reach out and contact me. We'll provide that information and provide you any other information that you want. So it's very simple. It's a minute phone call. Usually when you call into their office, it's a receptionist that picks up, and you just kind of, hey, what's the representative's position on this, and your position that they should be following these efforts. Because I have gone over time like I usually do, I am going to skip through what else is going on in Congress in terms of ag workforce efforts and jump right to questions if anyone has any. I do know it's the end of the hour, and so if you do have to jump off and you do want to ask a question later, my email and cell phone or phone is on the bottom of the screen in the lower left-hand corner. Otherwise, please just stay engaged and watch for updates from this as it progresses through the House, or any updates that we can share. So right now, I'll open it up for questions, and there's 2 ways for you to do that. On your taskbar of your webinar, there is a little hand that you can raise. Click that. We'll be able to see your hand, and then we will be able to unmute you. And then there is a questions tab where you can type in your questions, and we will be able to see them. So please don't be shy. I'll stay on as long as folks have questions. But if you do have to jump off, please reach out and contact me. Is there any questions? I'm not seeing any. Well, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to end the webinar. But first, I want to thank everyone for jumping on today's webinar to review this piece of legislation as something that we've worked on pretty extensively over the last several months, and we'll continue to work on and continue to improve as the bill does progress through Congress. Please don't be shy to reach out to your elected officials or reach out to me to see what your elected official stance is on this bill, as a lot of those behind the scenes conversations are happening with the appropriate legislative staffer and appropriate congressperson. Also, I will add, for our South Dakota folks, please watch for an email coming from me either later today or tomorrow morning, as we're setting up an opportunity to engage Congressman Dusty Johnson, who is your congressperson in the House of Representatives, to provide additional insight and to answer any questions. So with that, thanks everyone for joining me on today's webinar, and wish everyone a good rest of the week. Thank you. Oh, how do I stop this?